Welcome to the Leadership Art Podcast. I'm your host, Art Robbins, and it's great to have you join us. The Leadership Art Podcast features insightful conversations with industry leaders who lead with purpose. Here you will discover practical insights, powerful lessons, and everyday inspiration to elevate your own impact, whether you are leading now or preparing to step up. We want to inspire you to be the best leader you can be. And today's guest is Lorraine Marchand. Lorraine is a business innovation and strategic growth advisor with 3 decades of experience specializing in innovation commercialization, data and AI, digital transformation, and strategic partnerships. Lorraine has held senior leadership roles at IBM, Bristol-Myers Squibb, LabCorp, and Cognizant, and has co-founded 4 companies. She advises Fortune 500 clients, including Hewlett-Packard, Johnson & Johnson, and Novartis, and also serves on corporate and nonprofit boards. Lorraine also teaches at Columbia Business School, Wharton, and Yeshiva University. And she is a sought-after speaker and award-winning author of The Innovation Mindset, and her new book, which is out February 10th, is No Fear, No Failure, which is a guide for companies to drive growth by fostering a culture of innovation. Lorraine, welcome to the Leadership Art Podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Art. I appreciate this opportunity, and it's an honor. I know the caliber of the guests that you have on your program, and so it's my pleasure to have some time to talk with you about our favorite topic, innovation.
Oh, well, that's great, Lorraine, and you're going to raise the caliber even higher. I know that. I think one of the reasons I'm so excited to have you as a guest is you've had an amazing journey and a very measurable impact on the companies, organizations, universities, all the communities you've served. And I think it's interesting, your new book coming out, the title is No Fear, No Failure. And when I heard that, I think it describes you to a T because you just go out there and make things happen. You impact so many different communities in many different ways.
Well, I try to do that, Art, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, I love to talk about our guests' journeys and how they get to their current position, how they develop their current philosophy. And I'm just curious in your case, I mean, was it always that way? I mean, what were the things along your journey that have helped shape your own leadership and innovation philosophy?
No, well, thank you for that question, Art. I really appreciate it. And I'll start with 2 opening stories. I believe that we already have a lot formed about who we are when we're adolescents. And one of my first stories takes place when I was 12 years old. My father was a serial, meaning repeat, inventor. We didn't even have the term innovation at the time.
Right.
And growing up, he would always try to find 2 and 3 different problems around the house. And he would challenge my brother and I to come up with deconstruction of the problems and solutions. And this one summer, he took us to the Hot Shops cafeteria in Wheaton, Maryland. Our job was to observe table turnover for 3 days and figure out what was slowing it down or thwarting the turning over of the tables. And with our 3-color pens and our graph paper and our timers, we determined that it was the sugar packets that people were disposing sugar in their coffee and tea. So we went through my dad's tutelage. We came up with 3 solutions. We took one to prototype, and the sugar cube was happily purchased by the manager of that Hot Shops cafeteria. For your listeners who may not know, Hot Shops cafeteria grew into the Marriott Corporation. And so for a period of time, our sugar cube was purchased and we got some royalties from the Marriott Corporation. So that was such a seminal experience because, first of all, I learned it through my dad.
And you were
He
12
made,
years old
and I was 12 years old, and he made it safe to fail. I mean, there was no goalpost here. We didn't have to make a revenue producing sugar cube. It was fun. We were solving problems. He introduced us to the concept of customer research. And that lesson just really stuck with me. And so throughout my life, I've always looked for really interesting problems to solve. They weren't all, at the diner. That was a small problem. And I think the next seminal experience occurred when I grew up, got out of college, and one of my first jobs was at the National Institutes of Health. I had a seat in clinical research. I was a writer at the NIH, and I had an eye into all of these amazing therapeutic advances that were going to be changing medicine. The first of gene therapy, stem cell therapy, rare disease. And I observed the clinical trial infrastructure at the time, which was doctors' offices, mom and pop doctors' offices. Clinical trials were only being conducted in middle-aged white men. There was no focus on ethnicity, internationalism, gender diversity. And I thought, wow, these therapies are really going to be thwarted if we don't improve this overarching clinical research infrastructure. We need a much more scalable infrastructure for these medicines to come to market and help all of those in need. And so I decided that that was the problem that I wanted to tackle. But I knew I couldn't take it on alone. So I just made it my goal that that was going to be the problem that was going to guide my career and my choices. And so for most of my career, it really has the theme that I've had is that in every position that I've taken, I've wanted to understand the world of, making drugs, therapies for patients, getting drugs to market faster. I've wanted to understand different aspects of it so that I could continue to tackle that problem of how to advance human health and well-being.
Well, it sounds like you really found your passion early and you embraced it and you kept advancing and making improvements on how to achieve that goal.
It's funny because I can tell the story now with so many years behind me, and it seems very planned and it all makes sense. But it
It
didn't
wasn't
feel that way
planned.
no, it didn't feel that way at the time. I was definitely flying by the seat of my pants. It was a little bit of intuition, it was a little bit of opportunity, but I do like to share that perspective in retrospect with students that I teach and young people that I mentor because I think that to have a satisfying career, you have to be passionate about what you're doing and finding a problem that really turns you on, that you want to solve, that you can dedicate your career to is a really great way to do that. So I just like to open the aperture in people's minds and get them to think a little bit more broadly about what they're doing, what their passions are, what problems they're solving, because so often early in your career, you can get sort of sequestered into a box and then you
Mhm.
can look at climbing that proverbial ladder, to the next box, the next box, the next box, only to find out that somehow your spirit's deflated, you don't feel energized anymore, you're not really sure what journey you're on, and you need to do some time reflecting. A lot of times these individuals end up coming to graduate school, which is where I encounter them because they think that an MBA is going to solve all of their problems. And that's not going to solve your problem if fundamentally you are not connected to what problem you want to solve and where your passions lie. So it all comes back
Yeah,
to that fundamental question.
that's true. I mean, the MBA might open up some new doors, but you won't know what door to walk through if you don't have your passion and your mission defined.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. The other thing, as you were talking, you kind of jumped ahead to a question that I usually ask in all of these episodes is, who are your mentors? Who has influenced you in your life, in your career? And the number one answer by far has always been the parents.
Mm.
Most people say both, but the father is mentioned more than the mother, frankly. And, it's just notable how your father has shaped your mission and your direction at such an early age.
Yeah, he really did. He was very inspiring, fearless, opened the aperture so that we could explore. I do have to give a lot of credit to my mother, though, because she was the implementer. She was
Mhm.
always the one in the family who got things done because I grew up in a family owned business. And,
Okay.
while my dad was the big idea generator, it was oftentimes my mom, in a family owned business who was making sure that things got done, the phone got answered, orders got filled. And so I think I'm really blessed because I learned the strategic idea side, but I also learned the implementation side. And so those two hands can fold together and I know how to think something through, but also get it done. And that's very important. You got to have that pull through in your career too.
Yeah. Now, as you got further into your career, I mean, you've gotten involved in so many different things. I mean, not just working for companies, but founding companies, being on boards, teaching. How have you decided what to focus on and how do you manage the balance of all that?
Well, Art, I have to be very honest with everyone here because I don't suggest that people follow my behavior in this case. I have a
That's
terrible, terrible
okay.
I have a terrible problem saying no. I mean, that's sort of the curse of being in love with innovation is that every opportunity you see just excites you and you think about the
Yeah.
possibilities. So I'm not very good at saying no. But seriously, the answer to that question is I learned early on that because I had so many different interests, that they couldn't all be satisfied with a job.
Mhm.
So maybe a job was going to absorb 40% of my intellectual curiosity and probably more of my capacity because I had to be full time, but it wasn't going to fulfill me. And so I didn't look for the job to fulfill all of the different facets of my interests. I decided that I should look at myself from a portfolio perspective and
Mhm.
think about the different assets that I had, capabilities, capacity that I had, and what were other things that I could do in my life to round that out so I could be fulfilled. And I found a lot of satisfaction through teaching, through consulting others that were in startup situations, growth counseling for professionals, career development, and ultimately writing, which I started my career as a writer. And so I've kind of come full circle to writing. So I also advocate that individuals take that portfolio approach to themselves and their own careers, knowing that you're going to be sorely disappointed if you think that all of your satisfaction can possibly come from one job. It can't. And so you're going to have to make room for other endeavors and volunteer activities and other parts of your life in order to be fully fulfilled and in order to make sure that all of those capacities and capabilities and talents are being fully optimized. Because I think we have an obligation as humans to use all of the talents that we have for good to the extent we can.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think people who are ambitious and really committed to their career, they just have a tendency to do more. I mean, it's not unique to have problems saying no. You say yes because you're curious. You're intellectually curious. You want to have a bigger impact. You want to accelerate your own personal development. And that, I think especially the benefit when you're involved in a field like innovation, the more experiences, the more data points you have, the more likely you are to do a better job at innovating because you just have more points of reference to develop new ideas or patterns. The more in your data set, the higher the chance that you'll come up with some really great new ideas.
Exploration is the heartbeat of innovation. And so you do have to be a student of exploration, of curiosity. So you're absolutely correct about that. You do have to stay tethered. And for me, at a point in my career, I also created a mission statement. I know that's important to you and a big theme
Mhm,
here.
mhm,
And I determined that my mission statement was around being able to foster an environment where entrepreneurship and innovation could grow and develop. And of course, my industry area was the life science and healthcare. And so my own personal interest area was advancing human health and well being. And so if I think about all the things that I said yes to in my portfolio, the one filter that I had to put them through is do they align with the mission statement? So, I didn't go off the reservation, as they say, to do all sorts of wild and crazy things that might have come my path. They had to align with that, fostering an environment where innovation, entrepreneurship can be cultivated and I could help other people with their endeavors and ultimately advancing human well-being. There are a lot of innovations out there. They're not all for good and they're not all advancing humankind. And so it's very important to me as well to be on the positive, productive, good side of what it is we're innovating.
Yeah, no, that's again, that's great advice to have that mission statement. And I've told people in my own counseling, and it's come up in prior podcasts, that if you don't know who you are, if you don't know your own purpose, you don't know what direction to point your compass in. And how can you make the right decision if you don't know where your compass should be pointed? So it all fits together. I mean, that's the key to being able to have a measurable impact.
Yes, knowing where that true north is, as you say, in
Mhm.
that compass metaphor, very apt.
Yeah. And now we're kind of talking about how do you lead your own life and career? How do you have an impact? But you're in a position where you influence so many other people on how to innovate, how to be effective. Being an innovation leader is yet an even higher responsibility. So how do you get other people to embrace innovation? I mean, some of them in any organization, you're going to see the full spectrum, right? You're going to see people who are naturally innovative, exploratory, curious. They'll jump right on board. But then you have people at the other end of the spectrum that are afraid of all that stuff. I guess this might get into your latest book and all. How do you get them to confront those fears and embrace innovation and be part of their team, because their contribution and their buy-in is probably mandatory in order to have a successful outcome if you're in a large organization.
Yeah, and I have to admit that on this one, Art, I learned the hard way. So
Okay.
I would
We,
say,
we, we we love those stories.
yeah, I would say in my first forays as a manager, I fell into the trap of number one, thinking I had to have all the answers and believing that it was my job to use a little bit of force to get people to cross that like goal line. You know, the old adage, time to get on the train or go home, whatever that is,
Right,
a little
right.
bit of that hierarchical commanding control. And I learned that it didn't work. So, in an innovative fashion, I had to modify and experiment with some other methodologies. And now my philosophy
What
is
what feedback? I'm just curious before you go to the next step. What made you realize it wasn't working? Because I've heard stories where people say, "Yeah, the other people, the resistors just told me, no, we're not going to do it." But a lot of times, people just nod their heads. They say they're going to do it, and nothing happens. And you find out after the fact. And usually you're put in an awkward, if not dangerous position because you had no idea it wasn't working.
yeah, no, that's exactly what happens. And I was really fortunate in a very early situation that I had a direct report to whom I felt comfortable making myself a little bit vulnerable, which is a leader. You have to be vulnerable
Mhm.
at times.
Right,
And
right.
just asking her straight up, like, why isn't this working, Diane? And she said, because Lorraine, nobody has a picture of what the future looks like and where they fit in it. We don't
Mhm.
know. We don't know what this looks like. We don't know what to do differently. We don't know how to do this new job because we've never done it. And that was a aha moment for me. And I realized that no, I can't give them a recipe card, but I can give them a roadmap. I can paint a picture for them of the future state. I can try to tell them what their new job will entail. And importantly, I learned this point, and I think it's really important in change efforts to think about this. I started by telling them what wasn't changing.
Mhm.
Our overarching goals are not changing. Our strategy is not changing. Maybe we're reorganizing, maybe we're doing the work a little bit differently, but let's focus on what's not changing and then we can tackle the 40% that is changing. And when I started to reframe it like that, people calmed down, they relaxed, they didn't think I was throwing them into the deep end anymore. And then we more or less systematically worked through it. The other thing that leaders fail to recognize is if you are the direct report getting yet one more exciting assignment, but you have 9 other things on the list that you're required for fulfilling, well, this all of a sudden doesn't feel exciting or interesting anymore. It just feels like my day keeps getting longer and longer. And
Right,
so I think
right.
it's really important to help your team reprioritize. And I like to say, delete something first before you add the new thing. So I think that being a leader of innovation is very much being a servant of your team. You are serving the team, you are trying to bring out the best in them. And so you need to focus on giving them the skills, the resources, the time, the roadmap that they need in order to be successful. So it was a lot less about me leading the charge and a lot more about me doing what I could to bring out the best in my team. And when I reframed it that way to figure out what I could do to serve my team in the spirit of our innovating or changing, things just started to turn around. Now, ultimately, you are going to have some individuals who just don't agree, they're not on board. And with those individuals, I worked on the tact of having a very honest conversation with them. You know, it seems as though this isn't resonating with you. That's okay. Let me help
Mhm.
you figure out what the future looks like for you. And let's have an honest conversation about what you want, where you want to be, and how I can help you get there. And so, even if it meant that people left the team, they knew they could count on me to have their back, to be honest, to help them find something new in the organization. And once they knew they could trust me for that, we could have a lot more honest dialogue. And ultimately, that's what, as a leader, you should be doing, right? It's all about
Yeah.
getting your team in the right places where they can shine. So that was a hard lesson when I learned the hard way. But once I figured it out, that is now my mantra. And it's what I definitely encourage leaders that come to me for consult to do. That's one of the first diagnostics that we conduct.
Oh, excellent points. Well, what do you say to a leader who's in an organization where the board is directing him that, hey, we want to innovate, but we want to innovate to cut costs, to cut labor? There will be less jobs. And yet the leader is responsible for everything you just described to get the team on board to come up with the right solution, but also to reduce costs.
Yeah.
How do you advise them?
Yeah, I mean,
Do
I've been in that situation personally, and I've also been in a situation to advise when the strategy is around greater efficiency. And
Mhm.
so the innovation is more incremental, things that affect the bottom line, changing processes, workflows, reducing, as you point out, labor. And in those situations, I think it's really important to bring people in alignment with the organization's overall goals and strategy, to be honest with them about that, again, to help them see themselves in the future, why the organization needs to make these changes. And if it does mean that somebody is creating or enabling a situation where they're going to work themselves out of a job, making sure that you have a path for them, skills they can develop, other things that they can think about, other places in the organization where they might go. So I think it's very important to be honest and then get people aligned with the organization's overall strategy and goal. It's not easy. And so I think it takes a lot of empathy. And again, looking at it from the perspective of the team member, doing what you can ultimately and being there to guide them. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but people will always remember, I think we talked about this when we first met, that
Mhm.
people remember how you made them feel
Correct.
more than
Correct.
anything else about you.
Yeah.
And so I think if people feel understood, listened to, empathized with, even if a result isn't in their favor, they will remember that as a leader, you tried to do the best that you could for them.
Yeah. One thing I'd add and emphasize, you talked about playing a servant leadership role. I think the leader not only should be sensitive to the team and, establishing their trust, making them feel better about the situation. But I think there's also an opportunity there for him or her to represent the team to their superiors and say, this is how the team is feeling.
Mm.
You should address these concerns. Maybe we need to have better severance packages or outplacement counseling. And we can assure team members that might not be with the company, hey, we do have your back. We are going to take care of you. I mean, a lot of times, senior management or boards are so far removed from the actual people on the line, they have no idea. Some of them may not care. That's another issue. But a lot of them do care. They just, are out of touch. And the innovation leader is kind of in the fulcrum here, can really elevate those sensitivities to come up with an overall better solution.
Well, that's an excellent point. And it is your job to be an advocate inside and outside as well. So I think that's an excellent point. Leaders absolutely need to do that and represent that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd actually like to explore a little bit about your new book, No Fear, No Failure, because I think it's a very interesting concept. And I wonder if maybe you could expound a little bit on the basic mantra of the book and what you see to accomplish by publishing it right now.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And this book grew out of research and customer feedback. So, in my first book, The Innovation Mindset was published, which is about how you as an individual can take your idea and bring it to the commercial marketplace. And I was doing workshops and keynotes, and I had the senior level person of a biotech company approach me after a talk. And he said, our organization is going through a lot of change. They're bringing in new leadership. We're growing, we're scaling. And we've always been very innovative, but we're all really afraid that innovation is going to start to diminish because of the corporate level changes that we're making. And I wonder, Lorraine, if you could help us figure out what is the antidote to staying innovative as we are on the path to becoming a corporate behemoth. How do we as individuals stay innovative in our teams and organizations? And that was a terrific question, to go from an individual innovation mindset to now an organizational
Mhm.
mindset. So I brought some of my own experiences at different companies that I've worked with. You mentioned a few of them. And then I was going to interview 120 executives. And these are from different industries across the globe, those who've been successful, those who haven't, in order to talk about what was the key, the secret sauce of maintaining an innovative culture. And what came up time and time again was this theme around failure. And when organizations, when teams, when individuals feel this threat of failure, if they experiment and it doesn't work out, their appetite for innovation is diminished.
Mhm.
And so, finding out that was the problem we were trying to solve, I then explored, well, what are the 5 tenets that we could diagnose in order to understand if fear was in the operating system, so to speak, in the culture, in the operating system, and what would be some of the areas that we could address. And so, in that identification of the components of what was contributing to fear, but could be flipped over to also be part of the solution, I came up with 5 principles that have become the framework for the book. And they do start with culture. What kind of a culture are we setting? Do we reframe failure as experimentation, as intelligent failure, as continuous learning? Is it okay to fail here because we're going to learn from it? Or are we punitive about it? Really important that the customer's first. So for organizations that don't put the customer first and they don't really make themselves students of what it is that motivates the customer, what the customer needs, they're going to fail to innovate because they're going to succumb to inside out thinking, right? And we've all seen this in
Mhm.
companies. We drink the Kool-Aid, we tell ourselves what we think the customer needs, but we really haven't done the right kind of research. The third one is collaboration. And I like to say that collaboration, fortunately, has evolved from being a nice to have on a behavioral list of things that you get credit for doing. I was nice to my colleagues and we all get along, and it's now a strategic imperative. And it means that every part of the business, products, services, service functions, all come together, united around the corporate goals, objectives, and the customer in order to solve problems and make more meaningful solutions. And so a lot of times new solutions are coming to the fore because we're bringing all of these different components of the business together, not operating in silos anymore, but crossing those boundaries and creating solutions together, bringing more diversity of thinking and perspective. The fourth one is chance. And what I mean by chance is our proclivity to take risks. And are we investing? So are we taking some of our budget to invest in wholesale innovation? So blue sky. Are we investing in our people and giving them the latitude to create and try new things? In this one, I like to recall the words of Sergey Brin of Google. He created the golden ratio very early on, the 70-20-10 rule. And what he learned is that Google was investing 70% in core, 20% in adjacencies, and 10% in net new. And as he looked out over where the revenue growth was coming from in the company 5 years later, there was an inverse correlation. 70% of new growth was coming from the 10% that was investing in this blue sky innovation. And so companies can use their own numbers, but they need to keep this top of mind in order to make sure that they're creating an environment for innovation from a resource and a budget perspective. And then the fifth one is change. So how do we really get the organization to embrace the future, to move together? We talked about some of the things that you can do, show people what the future looks like, help them to see what's not changing, help them to reprioritize and delete something first. And so each of these principles in the book has a case study in terms of where it can lead to contributing to a fear of failure, but then also how once you diagnose it, you can turn it around and use it as a prescription for improving your organization's resilience around embracing and using failure as an operating model for learning and growth.
Let me throw a scenario at you. Let's say you're a rising star executive and you're actually brought into a company to help drive innovation. And just by nature, you are less fearful than your superiors, okay, who've been there a long time. They're entrenched in their positions. And you want to do bold things, you want to innovate, you want to operate in that 10%, so Sergey's 10%, but you're finding the bosses are suppressing you. You're not able to, you know, some things you might not even be able to get off the ground, or the things that they do okay, they're compromised, right? They kind of lost their oomph. How do you manage through that?
Yeah, well, that is a very common scenario,
Yeah.
not just for me, but I'm sure for all of your listeners. And I think there are a few things that you need to do. Number one, I think it's very important that you listen well and understand the perspective of these leaders who may be entrenched or following the status quo mentality, to know what motivates them, what they're fearful of, what goals and objectives they're trying to achieve. And so, whatever it is you're suggesting as a new solution has got to advance those corporate goals and objectives and feel like something that is helping them move the company forward and is aligned with the organization and where it wants to go. So that's the first thing. You need to make sure that whatever it is you're suggesting fits with the organization, their model, their strategy, and goals. Number two, I think it's always really helpful to bring external data to the fore, right? Companies, number one, even though they might be a little obtuse when it comes to the customer, I've never met an entrenched objective who wasn't interested when I said I had some customer information. So I would say make sure that your solution is couched in good customer research, that you can bring the customer perspective to the fore and show some data in terms of why this makes sense, why it makes sense for the market, why it makes sense for the customer, why we believe we can grow. companies are also very competitive. So if you can get some benchmark from some of your competitors or other organizations, companies, what they're doing that's kind of similar and how it's working, that data can ultimately be very successful. And then I would say that the third component around implementation is asked to do a pilot. Now, I know we can have death by pilots, but the fact of the matter is most companies are not going to let you go big bang with
Right.
something new that
Right.
you want to try.
It's practical.
But yeah, but if you can say, look, this aligns with the corporate goals and objectives, the customers want it, the competitors are doing it, and really all I want to do is try this 6-month experiment in this little part of the business to do X, Y, and Z. And if it works, let's figure out what we want to measure, right? And if we're successful, how we can go ahead and move that forward and scale it. So those three parts are the formula, I think, for trying to work through resistance to innovation if you find yourself in a middle management role, wanting to be someone who's fomenting change.
That's excellent. Now, getting back to actual failure, I mean, failure is going to happen. And, insightful companies will want failure to happen because that means you're trying, right? You're learning things. You always learn from failure, right? So how do you reward failure? And
Well,
and then I guess maybe the extension of that question is when do you stop rewarding failure? Like a little bit is okay, but too much is not. So how do
yeah,
you sort of deal with all that?
that's a very insightful question, Art. Thank you. First of all, just to open that up, I want to just say that one of my favorite quotes is a 2019 shareholder letter that Jeff Bezos wrote, in which he said, if the size of our failure isn't growing, we are not going to be inventing at a size that will move the needle. And so Bezos at Amazon introduced a number of techniques for bringing forward new ideas, allowing folks to fail, incentivizing it. He rewarded people for failing because at least they tried as much as he rewarded people for the new ideas that Amazon took to market. But I think there are a few things you can do. In fact, I'm actually working on a failure report card or key performance indicators for failure
Mhm.
that companies could include. And I think that those metrics have to operate on a few different levels. I mean, the one thing that we want is behaviors where people feel that it's safe to experiment and they're encouraged to experiment. One of the things that I've done in corporate positions was introduce a concept of fail-free Friday. And I would bring my senior team together on Friday just for a 30-minute conversation around the horn. And I would just say, let's pick one person, what's not working? Like, what are you really frustrated with? What's not going well? Let's discuss it. Let's kind of, spitball around as a team. We don't have to solve it. We just want you to talk about it openly, like Amnesty Day. You don't have to shove it under the carpet anymore.
Yeah.
Let's just tackle it together.
And make it not embarrassing. I mean, the fact that it happened, it could actually contribute to everyone's knowledge base. It can make
Yeah.
everyone better to get it out in the open.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
think another thing that I've seen that I've encouraged leaders to do, and I've seen them institute this in, like, let's say software companies, is actually highlight a case study, with a team or an individual who had a problem to solve for a customer. It didn't go as planned. And, share what the learning was, but allow them to craft that in story fashion, what went wrong, what they learned from it. And that's really the key. If you take away some heuristics or key takeaways, we're now going to do this differently because of the mistakes that we made, then we transform and reframe that failure into an opportunity to learn, which is exactly what Microsoft's Satya Nadella advocates. He says, you need to reframe failure as continuous learning and make it something that you advocate for. And then your very intuitive question about when is it enough? I think you have to be able to discern strategic failure, right? Strategic controlled failure, trying something new because you're going into new areas, you're expanding markets, you're trying to solve a customer need. You have to be able to differentiate that from operating failures, right? Because if you have operating failures in your processes, in your workflows, in your administration, in your delivery, that's a different kind of failure. So we
Yes.
don't want to
Yes.
sanction operating failure. We want to sanction strategic failure. And so I think it's really important that you distinguish those two and you have a different set of metrics and a different antidote for how you assess and triage operating failure.
Right. Product recalls,
Right.
endangering customers, those
Exactly.
are, yeah,
No good.
those are not acceptable.
Yes. Yes. So that's a great question. Very good question.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I like you were using some business metaphors to describe it. I also like to use sport metaphors. I'm a big baseball fan. And like in baseball, if you're a batter and you bat 300, which means you get hit 3 out of 10 times, you might win the batting title these days. You could be the best in the league. That means you didn't get on base 7 out of 10 times. But if you speak with any athlete, they're obviously unhappy about those 7 times, and they're trying to learn from
Mm.
those at bats to improve the 3 or so times that they'll get on. So maybe their batting average, they can move it up from 300 to 310 or 320, which would be a big achievement.
And Art, that's such an important comparator or metaphor. I think that for whatever reason in sports and athletics, we seem to be able to manage and use failure as an opportunity to learn. I mean, what athlete doesn't have to watch a painful reel over and over again, right? In terms of why they missed the ball, missed hitting it
Right.
or receiving
And
or whatever it
they'll
was.
watch the reel of their misses. They won't watch the reel of their hits.
Yeah, you have to
Yeah.
study it and study it and
Yeah.
study it until you can figure out how to improve it, and that's how you get better, is by dissecting and dealing and addressing your failure. So my question is like, why don't we do that in business, right? Why do we have an opposite mentality of shoving it under the carpet as opposed to let's play the reel and look at what went wrong and learn from it? So I love the sports metaphor, and I would love to bring that athletic performance metaphor into the business world and say, hey, why can't we look at this a little bit more openly and honestly and learn from it?
Now, you could learn a lot from the way some of the best teams and some of the best organizations are managed. I mean, there really are. I mean, one of the things I've always said, and I think I learned this from my consulting, is that industry experience is great. You need it to run a business, but you should also look outside of your industry to
Mm.
see what best practices are being done and how can you apply some of those best practices to your own industry. Maybe that's yet another form of innovation. Maybe you'll be a first mover in your industry for using that best practice.
Well,
And that'll give you a sustainable competitive advantage.
yeah, no, you're very right about that. And actually, that is Bill Gates. That's his approach to innovation is, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Look around at other industries, find something comparable or even something that isn't, but look at how other people are doing things and then bring some of that into the fold and explore it. So you're exactly right. That is a very useful form of innovation. And it doesn't require doing anything wild and crazy. You just have to gather some evidence of what's going on in fintech or software or retail or whatever the case might be to get some interesting comparisons. I like that idea a lot.
Thanks. Well, Lorraine, we have covered so much and we're just about out of time here. If there's one key takeaway, if the audience has to remember just one thing from an episode, what's sort of the one key piece of advice you would give the audience before we sign off?
Yeah, well, I would like to encourage them to make themselves a student of problem solving and critical thinking. And if they can observe things that are around them that need to be improved, that's going to be the fodder for where they are going to innovate. And with that in hand, I think they also need to embrace this idea of experimentation, testing things. Don't be worried about the outcome. Just think about the journey and what you're going to learn. And if you set an objective for your innovation and it's a learning objective, it's going to be far more threatening to you to worry about what the outcome is.
Well, that's a great takeaway, Lorraine. I really appreciate you sharing, your great insights and inspiring us to be better at innovating, leading innovation, and making a positive impact in our communities. So thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you, Art, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And I hope that my book, when it comes out, will resonate with you and your listeners. That would make me very happy.
Okay, everyone look out for it. It's called No Fear, No Failure by Lorraine Marchand. And again, as always, I want to thank our listeners and followers for joining us and for your continued support. So until the next episode of the Leadership Art Podcast, this is your host, Art Robbins. And remember, it's your lead.